All right, so here's an overview of our agenda this morning. I'll be giving a quick update to some changes that you'll see in Best Practice 24, which is all around community engagement. You'll be hearing from Melissa and Chris about the Green Team Guide that just got launched this week officially. And then we'll hear from Kevin in Rochester, Jonee about Warren, Becky about Grand Rapids area, and Wendy from about Beltrami area. We have plenty of time for questions and answers. Hopefully you have a chat option now, and you can feel free to use that to ask questions, and we'll keep track of those. Or raise your hand feature. You know, we're nice and small today, so feel free to unmute yourself, turn on your video, ask a question too. This is all about exchanging, you know, thoughts, ideas, questions, answers, so feel free to participate in any way. So wanted to just start with a quick update to Best Practice 24. So if you were on the website 2 weeks ago and you looked at Best Practice 24, it looks different than what it looks like today because we recently made some updates to the language. What we have been doing kind of behind the scenes for the last couple of years, back in 2019, we worked with a national consultant through the Sustainable States Network, which is a network of other state programs like GreenStep cities and tribal nations who work on supporting municipalities, communities with sustainability and recognizing their efforts. So there's actually 14 states with programs that are similar to ours around the state, but it's been a great network to share kind of what we're working on, and equity in general has been a big focus for the network and many of our state programs. And so we had the opportunity to work with national consultant who helped us do a program scan of all 180 of our best practice actions and try to identify recommendations for how we could better include specifically racial equity, but other aspects of equity as well into our program. Make sure that there weren't any hidden negative consequences that we were were included in our guidance or anything like that. And so we had that great scan and then have been working with our best practice advisors who help us review best practice actions within the program. So there are technical experts, as well as our GreenStep Steering Committee Equity Work Group, which also includes our partners from the League of Minnesota Cities and Clean Energy Resource Teams and others. So we've all been kind of doing a behind the scenes update to best practices in the program, and Best Practice 24 is the first one we took kind of a deep look at and is now live on the website. And so what we'll be going through today in the Green Team Guide is all about Best Practice 24 and includes the changes that have recently been made to the best practice. And some of those changes include, looking at expanding community representation on committees and green teams so that we're including, people that represent the communities that you live in, increasing engagement with diverse community members and stakeholders. And we have a whole bunch of new implementation tools, many of which we'll talk about today or are in the Green Team Guide as well. And those relate to equity, diversity, welcoming communities, languages and translation, accessibility, and a lot more. And very exciting, we have a new action. So we never had a best practice action 24.7 before. That is now on the website, and it is around expanding community engagement, specifically with Black, Indigenous, people of color, renters, low income, new Americans, differently abled, and other traditionally underrepresented community members through engagement opportunities. And so you can find that now on the website and in the Green Team Guide. So that's our quick update for Best Practice 24. Stay tuned. We are making additional updates to other best practices on the website, and we will be sharing more of a summary of what those changes are across the board with you all once we are finished with those updates. And so some exciting changes to the program underway. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Melissa. I think you're going to kick things off for us.
I am. Thanks so much, Kristen. I'm Melissa Birch. I'm the Central Region Coordinator for the Clean Energy Resource Teams. And so in that capacity and also in my community, I do quite a lot of community engagement. And so I'm super excited to talk about our Green Team Guide that we put together to kind of help people along with doing equitable community engagement. So it does focus on Best Practice 24, like Kristen was saying. Next slide, please. And we focus on Best Practice 24 because it is the people part of the GreenStep program. So like if we think about sustainability or resilience, it really is founded on three kind of pillars or legs of a stool, as the case may be. And they're the three Ps: planet, prosperity, and people. And so Best Practice 24 really focuses in on the people part because people really bring a lot to the table when it comes to doing sustainability planning and implementation of programs. So they bring to the table information about on-the-ground conditions, and that can mean the difference between the success and the failure of an initiative, whether that's a policy or a program. They also can bring their values to the table, and by bringing the values in of the community, you're really providing a foundation to have more legitimacy of your decisions if you incorporate those values into the decision-making process. It also can help bridge social division. So I think we all know that there's a lot of polarization out there. And what we find is really that underneath all of the polarization, there are some common values, and if we speak to those values and really bring those into the decision-making process, then we can help bridge those social divisions. So in order to really get these benefits, you need to have engagement opportunities that are both accessible and welcoming to everybody in the community. And so next slide, please. One way of looking at accessibility is the curb cut effect. So as you may know, curb cuts are those little ramps that help folks in wheelchairs get up on the sidewalk. And what people found once these started being put in is that by designing for accessibility for folks in wheelchairs, you also saw benefits in accessibility for a lot of other groups. So in this example, parents pushing strollers, workers with heavy carts, people with luggage, skateboarders. So really thinking about making things accessible helps it become accessible for everyone, not just sort of the previously marginalized community that you were thinking of when you were thinking about accessibility. So this applies to more than just the physical design of spaces. It applies to engagement as well, and to the policies and programs that come out of engagement. So as you start thinking about how you're going to engage your community, think about those underrepresented groups. What would make this more accessible to those groups? And chances are you're going to make it more accessible to other groups as well. Next slide, please. So we did create a Green Team Guide for Best Practice 24. Yay! but why? Next slide, please. So anyone who's worked in community engagement or been part of community engagement for any length of time probably has some kind of engagement horror story. And it probably has something, it goes something along the lines of, there were 50 people in the room and they were all angry and they were all yelling at each other and they were all yelling at me. And nobody wants that, right? Like that's not the goal of engagement. And so what we hoped to do with this Green Team Guide is to really find ways to and find models around the state for people doing engagement in ways that lead to some of those positive things that I was talking about earlier and less of the horror stories. Next slide, please. So in the Green Team Guide, I don't expect you to read all the text on this page, but basically there are three main sections. The first section is a general section that includes kind of about the Green Team Guide, information about the curb cut, more about that curb cut effect, as well as some tips for effective community engagement. And we're going to kind of focus in on some of those 10+1 tips for effective community engagement a little later in the presentation. The second section takes a deeper dive into the 7 best practice actions that are part of Best Practice 24. And I'll talk in a moment about that. The third section is a set of additional models from around the state of Minnesota. There are some really great innovative models where people are doing community engagement in a really innovative and effective way. And so these are some stories about those models, as well as kind of resources and how you too can do something like that. So next slide, please. So as I said, the middle section focuses in on the 7 best practice actions. And these, for those who aren't as familiar with it, include action 1, which is inclusive and coordinated decision making. That tends to be around a green team. Actions 2 and 3 have to do with metrics and communication with community around goals and outcomes. The fourth action is public education campaigns and other ways to kind of get your community doing some great work around sustainability. Action 5 is planning with a purpose, which is using some kind of sustainability or equity or other framework to do a visioning process for your community. 6 is around working with youth and engaging youth in decision making. And 7 is what Kristen was talking about expanding community engagement to BIPOC folks, to differently abled folks, to, all the historically marginalized community members. Next slide, please. So for each best practice, and again, I don't expect you to read the whole slide. It's kind of a lot, and there's a lot of text that's very small. But the basic gist of this is each action in the guide has a 3-page section. And the first page focuses in on an example of someone who has implemented this this action in a really unique, innovative way. The second page starts to go into why this action is important, and then has guiding questions for implementing the action. In this case, it's expanding engagement. So those guiding questions are designed to really get you thinking about the process that you're using for engagement and how you can be more inclusive, more equitable, and more effective. And so every community is different. Every community is going to need to work in a slightly different way, implement in a slightly different way. And so the questions are to get you to think about, for my community, what's the best way of implementing this best practice action? And then finally, on the second page, you also have the star level examples. For folks who are familiar with the GreenStep website, you will remember the star level examples as kind of, okay, if you implement it at star level 1, then, you know, this is kind of what you need to do to implement it at that level, and then at level 2 or level 3. So that's kind of the second page. The third page, which Chris is going to talk about in a little bit, has to do with a lot of different resources that will help you implement this action. And so each, as I said, each action has these 3 pages, same format. It's designed to make it so that, yes, we want you to read the whole guide cover to cover because it's amazing, but we also recognize that you might just want to focus in on one particular action right now, and we tried to make it easy to do that. So next slide, please. So what I'd like to talk about now is really a few of those tips that I mentioned earlier, those 10+1 tips for effective community engagement. I'd like to talk a little bit about what those are. So the first 2 are build relationships and build trust. And when we say that, what we mean is build relationships with diverse segments of your community, but also among diverse segments of your community, because relationships are really what hold a community together when they're grappling with difficult things. And so building those relationships over time is a really key part of doing effective engagement. You want to have those relationships in place, you know, when you need to start engagement, before you start engagement on a particular issue. So it's important to build those relationships early on, and also show that you are worthy of trust, right? We often talk about building trust, and the best way to build trust is by showing that you can be trusted to be transparent, to listen, to respond to the priorities of your residents. I want to give a couple of examples of initiatives that really have built relationships, built trust. One is the Circle of Healing, which we're going to hear more about, but it's a stellar example of building relationships and building trust over an extended period of time. So we'll hear more about that from Becky LaPlant a little later in the workshop. I also want to talk about the City of St. Paul's Climate Justice Advisory Board. So it's possible to use your commissions, to your city commissions or your committees, to build trust, build relationships so that they are in place when you need to discuss something. And so the Climate Justice Advisory Board includes about 15 community representatives. It takes into account geographic distribution, as well as having representation from the business community, from the building and construction trades, and from academia. And it's also a great example of inviting youth into your commissions. They have 2 youth members on the advisory board, and they deal with really the making sure that the impacts and the measures that are taken to increase resilience are equitably distributed throughout the city with respect to climate. Another example of that we have in the guide that is about building relationships is Project Fine in the southeast part of the state, which helps create welcoming communities by building relationships between employers and immigrant communities. So that's another great example that you can find in the guide. Next slide, please. So as you're doing your engagement, it's really key. I mean, everyone says this, and yet I think it's really important to reiterate. A really key piece is listening to what community members are saying, listening to what their underlying values are, and that's a way to help find that common ground. Value their lived experience. And if it's a really tricky conversation that you need to have, consider bringing in a facilitator, an outside individual who can be impartial in the process. So we have here the example of Engage Winona, which is an organization in Winona that helps build relationships within the community, and it facilitates public engagement, including for the city of Winona and Winona County. They also have a fantastic program called Lived Experience Leaders, which is a cohort program that builds capacity among diverse community leaders. So that's one of the examples that we have in the guide, and definitely worth looking at if you're interested in doing community engagement. Next slide, please. There are a couple, as I mentioned, a couple of actions related to data. Data is really useful for showing where there's been progress, where there needs to be progress. And it's important as you're using data to think about what's going to be meaningful for your community members and how you can communicate it in an accessible way. It's also really important to think about what kind of assumptions are built into the data that you collect and how you communicate it, because data tells a story, and every story is told from a perspective. And so thinking about data from that perspective, thinking about what the perspective is that is embodied in the data is really an important thing to do if you're concerned about equity and communicating with your community. There's a great webinar, nice provocative title, How Not to Use Data Like a Racist. Definitely, if you are nerdy like me, you will love this webinar because it really helps you dig into what is the perspective that's behind the data that we use, and how can we be equitable in how we use data. On the story front, stories are a great way to build empathy, to build understanding, and if you want to find common ground in your engagement, using those stories, allowing people to tell stories and to hear stories and to think about stories is very useful. And these can be written stories, they can be spoken stories, they can also be visual. So we have a section in the guide at the end that introduces using photos in community engagement. So we would really encourage you to take a look at that. There are a lot of different ways to use photos in community engagement, and one of them that we highlight is called Photo Voice, and it's a great way to really, help people tell their stories in a visual way and highlight what's important to them as part of an engagement process. Next slide, please. And here I think I'm handing it over to Chris Meyer.
Hi, everybody. I am Chris Meyer. I'm the Southeast Search Coordinator, and I live in Winona, Minnesota. Thanks, Kristen. Winona is one of 5 counties that participated in a rural climate dialogue. And I wasn't on the jury, but I did get to attend the sessions and see the citizen jury process in action. Page 34 of our Green Team Guide describes more about the process, how it works, and it provides you some links. The two nonprofits that organized these events were IATP, which is the Institute for Ag and Trade Policy, and the Center for New Democratic Processes. And the citizen jury method brought together a microcosm of the community to study a topic, and that topic was climate change, and they generated a shared community response. So the two organizations worked in each of the communities for months in advance to get to know leaders and to come up with the topics of concern in those communities. And they then did thousands of solicitations, and they would pick 15 to 20 residents to be on the jury. And care was taken to make sure that those individuals demographically represented the county where the dialogue was being held. The participants, in order to reduce barriers, they were paid a stipend, and their childcare and transportation costs were paid for. And they met over several days. They agreed on their communication ground rules, and then they would receive a set of presentations from local, regional, or state experts on the topics that had been generated from those initial sessions by the organizations in the county. And then there were small group discussions. At the end, the citizens themselves came forth with a set of community actions that they recommended based on the topic. As a process, I would have to say that perhaps the greatest success story in using a citizen jury is probably from Morris, Minnesota, which is in Stevens County. And through the dialogues, they actually became a climate adaptation leader. You can read more about this on page 18 of the guide. It identifies the Morris model as an exemplary of public education for action. So the climate dialogues ultimately spurred broad collaboration in Stevens County between the University of Minnesota Morris, the county itself, and the city of Morris. They developed and they implemented climate change adaptation strategies. And so they set some really lofty goals that they would be producing 80% of the energy consumed anywhere in the county locally by 2030, and that they would reduce energy use throughout the county by 30% by 2030, and that they wouldn't generate any landfill waste by 2025. And in subsequent years, as they've begun their implementation, they have won a number of sustainability awards. So it's an example of a process that can be very successful in some communities. Kristen, would you advance the slide again? So the best part of working on this guide really was getting to talk to people who are doing innovative and transformative work across the state of Minnesota. And I spent some time talking with Mindy Granley. She is the sustainability officer for the city of Duluth. And I learned that Duluth is the only community in Minnesota that has adopted something called priority-based budgeting, or PBB. And it's an accounting methodology that matches community priorities with available resources. In recognition of this, Duluth received the highest star level rating for Best Practice 24.2, Communicating Goals on Progress. Duluth used a really novel approach. They created a game. And in the beginning, this was a physical game where residents were given at certain events, public events, a set of coins, priority-based budgeting coins. And there were buckets that represented possible priorities, and they got to vote with those coins. Later, the game was moved to the city's website, but it had very high levels of participation. So that in the first 10 days that it was launched, over 800 residents of the city of Duluth went on to the website and participated in this game to say what they wanted the city's priorities to be. So you can learn more about priority-based budgeting on page 12, including organizations that give training on this accounting process. And in addition, you can see some examples from Duluth's budget books about how expenditures are displayed to the public in connection with the goals. in the budget book, specific expenditures for all the departments are actually tied back to the identified goals, how much was spent in the last 3 years, and then how much is going to be budgeted this year towards that priority. So again, it's an example for a community of being able to communicate how it is that they're meeting the priorities and collecting information about what citizens' priorities are. Kristen, if you would advance the slide. So I think that probably you, as a person on a green team, as a city staff person, as a community member that's engaged, you probably know your own community best. And so these are success stories of ideas that have worked in communities that tried them. But I think it's really up to you. You probably know what the most effective way to engage your community is. Kristen, could you advance again? So as Melissa described to you, the guide is divided into sections for each of the 6 best practice actions related to community engagement. And each section ends with a set of additional resources. And when Melissa and I wrote about the examples of cities that had success stories around one of the actions, we looked for supporting resources. So as I mentioned, when talking about priority-based budgeting in Duluth, well, in the resource section, you can find more information on that process. And when I learned about the equitable planning efforts in the city of Rochester, which you will hear about shortly from Kevin Bright, I investigated the organizations that I knew Rochester was using. So we also picked resources at a variety of entry levels, some for just the average citizen and some for professionals in planning and for city staff. And what I've really tried to pick out in the next 3 slides is really just a gem or 2 to take with you and some stories to maybe spark your interest to look further at the resources. So Kristen, could you advance the slide? I think if you really only learned about one resource from this presentation today, it would be about GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And I first learned about GARE at a presentation on Rochester's participation in a racial equity cohort. But then I heard about it again when I interviewed Rachel Lindholm, Richfield's sustainability coordinator, about their climate plan. So if you're just getting started in thinking about equity and how it relates to sustainability, GARE is a great place to start. And that's because the website has free downloadable guides and toolkits. But in addition to that, there are classes, there's training, and there are consultants. So there are resources that you can purchase that are at a much higher level and really designed to get projects going. So you can also learn on that website what other Minnesota cities have participated in a racial equity cohort, and you could connect with them. Richfield, Duluth, and Rochester are example communities, but there are a couple of dozen Minnesota cities that are currently members of GARE. Kristen, if you could advance the slides. So there are also some links to free introductory articles about why equity is important in this guide, and they could provide an easy entry point for the average citizen. So one of these is from the International City and County Managers Association, an article called Sustainability Through an Equity Lens, an Introduction. And there's a whole series of articles from the Engaging Local Government Leaders website. It's a 5-part series on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in government. Can you advance the slide again, Kristen? So lastly, what I want you to know is that we have a lot of Minnesota-based resources in this guide. So I was fortunate enough to attend Blandin's community leadership training with a Winona cohort back in 2015. Blandin conducts and pays all of the expenses for this training. The Blandin Foundation is located in northern Minnesota. And Winona has been sending groups of 12 or so citizens to train in the process of leveraging human capital for several decades with the Blandin Foundation. The effect is that we have around 100 community leaders in Winona in a whole variety of fields: elected officials, clergy, environmentalists, teachers, media, and they all have a common language and connection because of attending this program. And so really it's as a result of Blandin community training and their assistance that the Engage Winona organization was formed at all. And as you can read, and as Melissa talked about, their fabulous lived experience leaders program here in the city of Winona. There are also a variety of University of Minnesota resources that have been developed and are shared in this resource, in the resource section of the guide. It includes a toolkit that was developed by the Center for Small Towns at the University of Minnesota Morris and through the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships, which CERTS is a part of. The toolkit is called the Creating a Welcoming Community Toolkit, and the primary objective is to provide ideas and information to small towns to help them meaningfully engage with immigrants, refugees, and BIPOC, and to share what communities can do to be more welcoming and inclusive. And the Center for Small Towns at the University of Minnesota Morris itself is a resource that works individually with small towns and priorities that they've set. So I would encourage you to just look at the Minnesota-based resources that are in this guide, and even to look on the GreenStep Cities website. If you are interested in a particular best practice, look at what GreenStep Cities have already achieved that the rating and at what star level, and you can tell a little bit about the things that they've done, and their contact information is there. So you could connect with them, you could reach out to their staff, and you could ask for assistance. And that concludes what I was going to talk about today. I hope that you are able to use the guide.
Wow, thank you, Melissa and Chris, so much. Guys, if you have the ability to do an applause button on your teams right now, they put a lot of time and effort into this guide. There are so many resources. I did put the link in the chat, so hopefully you're able to open that and follow along. We'll send it out to you all as well. But that was just a snapshot of what is in that guide. There's a lot in there, so do take a look. Beth, I see a hand raised. Do you have a question?
No, I was trying to find the clapping
No.
button.
Well, now you can clap like actually, and we can hear you. Where I am not seeing any questions at this time in the chat. Does anyone else want to unmute or share? It doesn't have to be a question. It could just be a comment. Okay, there's a lot to think about. John.
Yeah, one of the things I'm wondering about with the, I help with the Best Practice 24, and I know that with city sustainability goals, and often they just share, for example, like Burnsville, a update to the community in a kind of a PDF document or newsletter. And so I'm wondering how to create an actual event where people can share how is it going, what do we want to improve. And that's happening, for example, with Bloomington, where their sustainability commissions meets with the city council every year. I'm also interested in seeing how cities and counties that have climate goals could meet up together with an event where community members could participate in a live event. For example, with Hennepin County having their new climate action plan and many of the cities having climate goals. So I know Kevin is shaking his head there, but I'm kind of curious, how do we maintain more visibility and accountability, especially moving toward 2030 and 2050 goals?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And so when you all do go on to Best Practice 24 on our website, you'll see Sean is our current best practice advisor for Best Practice 24. And so he's a great resource to connect with on these topics too, and to think through some of these things. All right. Well, we're mostly on schedule. So I have Kevin Bright from the city of Rochester up next. Kevin, are you sharing your screen and going through your slides? Okay.
Yeah, just trying to pull them up now. Can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me here to talk about a couple of exciting projects. I do have only 10 minutes, I believe, so I'm trying to condense a lot of information into a pretty quick amount of time. So to answer Sean's question a little bit, I think the more that we work together and share best practices and kind of what we're working on, I think we'll find, especially across cities and government, that we're struggling with the very same things. And the more we talk about it, the better the outcomes will be. So I'm all for that. And I know, and I imagine there are others too, that would be open to ways to compare notes and see how we might move farther, faster. But here I'm to talk about just a community co-design, a community participation approach that kind of ties to a lot of the kind of themes that Melissa reviewed earlier around the concept of building trust. So what do we set out to do? Basically, we're seeing the same people show up to meetings over and over again, and folks that had time or retired or of means, and we're framing a lot of policy and providing a lot of opinion, which we want. We want community member participation in projects, but we're basically hearing from the same people over and over again. So we set out to see how we might be able to approach projects differently, and particularly hear from populations within Rochester that historically have not been heard from or included in public decision-making processes. So in this case, there's two projects that I'll go over for our case study quickly. One was the design of a public park, and the second was the creation of our sustainability and resiliency plan. And both we prioritize the involvement of community members who were most heavily impacted by the effort, so who might benefit from a park the most, or who will be impacted by climate change the most, and make sure that they are either in part of the community engagement process as co-designers or prioritized involvement through the inclusion of the task force membership. So why is this important? I think we've heard this a couple times already, but crises or other things impact our communities disproportionately. I think our experience with COVID-19 that we're still living through is just further proof of that, where our communities of color are most heavily impacted by this pandemic, either through lost positions, rates of mortality, the list goes on and on. So unless we want to find a way out of crises or plan for better parks or have a more effective sustainability plan, it almost demands the inclusion of these voices in order to make sure that the product at the end will actually resonate with the community at large. Just as a data point here, 1 in 5 Rochester community members is a person of color. So any public process that we were really working through at the time, we weren't seeing 1 out of every 5 people in the room being a person of color. So we knew we weren't hitting our mark, or at least kind of the minimum acceptable level of participation, if you will. So just lay this out, and we'll share these slides as Kristen mentioned, just to kind of outline how we think or how we see this equitable or community co-design approach being significantly different than traditional engagement. One is we are prioritizing lived experience, and the way to kind of pick at that will show some of the questions that we ask through each planning exercise. It really comes down to what are the questions you're asking people and grounding them in their experience. It's very difficult to ask somebody, what do you envision for the future, when they're struggling on a day-to-day basis? And also their vision may not be that visionary because they're not able to get their minds there. But what they can get to is, hey, where do you really enjoy spending your time on a weekly basis? If you have a moment to yourself, where do you go? Who do you interact with and why? That's the critical pieces that we want to tease out of these processes, because that's where design and the beauty of design can really happen. That's where design professionals are at their best, when they understand, okay, what are these pieces within communities that are already doing great work or already having an impact on community individuals, and how can we further embellish upon those things? So that's really what community co-design focuses on, is what are our people's lived experience? Where are they going? Where are they spending time? How are they enjoying themselves? And how can these plans align themselves with those kind of key themes that we're hearing from the communities themselves? As mentioned, the community co-designer roles were compensated, so we were trying to remove any barriers that might exist or prevent people from participating. So if they had to attend a meeting but weren't able to go to their job, we were paying them around $20 to $25 an hour for their co-designer fee. And the co-designer role, it kind of has two parts to it. One is to be a community representative essentially and participate in design open studios, as we called them. And then the second was also participating or acting as a community liaison. So taking questions that we co-developed with co-designers back to their communities, however they define them, and conducting interviews with their community members and bringing that larger perspective back to the next studio meeting so that we weren't primarily kind of trying to address the concept of tokenism, that we weren't putting people in a position to speak on behalf of their community, but rather providing them time and compensating them for conducting interviews with their community as they defined it. Also tried to cover transportation and childcare costs. Depending on the project, this kind of takes a different form. If folks raise their hand and say, yes, this would be helpful, we make it happen. On other projects, we just built it into the stipend itself. And then the time of day would also take some care too to make sure that folks are available. This isn't causing undue stress to them personally, so that they can kind of fully participate without their mind being someplace else during the meetings. From the community barriers, I think we did a good job, and Melissa particularly kind of talking about what community barriers in the past ways that we've engaged the communities, what are those kind of reinforcing. And I think we know that we're largely hearing from the same people and historically over decades have, and the public policy, park design, and other things all kind of reflect the participation itself. For all that said, we have a couple projects to talk through quickly in the next couple of minutes. So Discovery Walk is a linear park that covers 5 blocks in downtown Rochester. We just got bids back, so hopefully this will begin construction in 2022. But right now it's kind of a concrete wasteland. It's very car focused, car centric, and we want to create a walkable link to connect our main public square area to a public park area called Sodersfield Park that's over 200 acres worth of space that really nobody accesses right now because this is their experience in trying to get there. No one knows that there's this natural oasis 5 blocks away because you have to go through this concrete wasteland in order to get there. Hopefully no one's taking any offense to this, but that's kind of my experience, so I hope they understand. Anyways, from a community engagement standpoint, we do work through the stakeholder power mapping analysis. This is the graphic itself, and the tool is from groupmap.com if people are looking for tools to help them kind of just organize their thoughts. But basically what we did is identify what communities or individuals or groups or nonprofits are most impacted by the project that we're working on. It could be a physical project, it could be a planning project, you name it. And let's prioritize their membership, right? So this top left quadrant here are who are most highly impacted and historically have had the lowest amount of access to these processes itself. And those are the groups that we either prioritize their involvement in community listening sessions or prioritize their membership as part of the task force or prioritize them as co-designers and try to recruit folks from those portions of the community to make sure that their input was heard and also influenced the project design. So for Discovery Walk, we worked with 2 community-based organizations. Melissa mentioned the importance of building trust. In this case, we had built some trust with some community groups, but not all. So for the ones that we didn't, we sought out the Diversity Council, Olmsted County Public Health, who have spent years, frankly decades, establishing trusted relationships with community, particularly those that have been historically disenfranchised. And asked who would be great individuals. We explained kind of what we were trying to do, the type of representation and voices that we were trying to have and incorporate in the project design, and worked with them to help identify folks. And their trusted voice was really what mattered in order to get folks to raise their hand and participate in kind of this pilot process. So if you don't have time and years to necessarily spend building trust for your planning projects, not everybody does, there are groups in your community that you should reach out to, talk with about what you're trying to accomplish. And I'm sure they would be interested in helping you. As soon as we started doing that, folks came out of the woodwork, raising their hand, wanting to help and figure out how we can make this happen. So there's a lot of support out there, and don't be shy to talk about what you're aiming to do, because it will resonate with a lot of folks. As I mentioned, these are the questions that we asked the co-designers themselves, and then also asked that they start as co-designers asking of their community. But you'll see they're very broad, and what we're trying to do is ground folks in their lived experience and draw from that in order to design a better public park. The feedback we got was largely in 3 buckets: spatial, programmatic, and policy. From spatial or programmatic perspective, some of the bigger themes that we heard were communities of color specifically didn't see anything in public park design that let them know that that space was for them. Whether it be flags, vegetation, games within public spaces, they'd walk by and say, I don't see anything that's familiar to me, so why would I assume that this place is meant for me? And that, out of this process, probably smacked me across the face more than anything as a aha moment for me personally, say, that makes total sense. Okay, how can we start to address it? And then the design professionals got to work to fully understand and start to bake in what those cultural signals could be and see if they resonate with the co-designers and their inherent communities to build a better public park and design a better public park. There's also some things inevitably that came up as part of this conversation around policy. So lights shut off in public parks at 10 p.m. We heard from some of our particularly Latino participants that, or Latinx participants that didn't work for them. Culturally, the party just is getting started at 10. So when the lights shut off on their party, they're like, well, this space isn't for me, so I'm going to seek out other places to go. Again, an aha moment. That makes total sense, and I would feel the exact same way. But until you hear that perspective from somebody's lived experience, you know, you're just unaware. It's just not something that's part of my personal existence. So providing spaces and like this and processes like co-design, I think really matter in order to help uncover what those key pieces of information are. I also included the Sustainability and Resiliency Task Force in here just for reference, because I only have 10 minutes. I'm not going to be able to go through these. But we used a very similar co-design process for the task force. The questions are in here, kind of where we landed, and the development of the plan itself is included, as well as a snapshot of all the community listening groups that we sought out. But I did want to spend a minute on just what's gained out of this. One is a deeper level of connection with communities. It cannot be replicated in open house. And really what we're doing is we're bringing our community together faster than we, I think, ever were able to before, because we're prioritizing and compensating individuals and communities and bringing them more deeply into public planning processes. We're creating we're opening up the democratic process in a way in Rochester that I don't think we have in the past. We're also developing kind of cultural diversity and inclusivity competencies, but it's flowing in all directions, right? It's across communities of color, it's within the communities of color and the public planning process team or the project team itself. The designers are also learning from this. So the amount of diversity, equity, and inclusion learning across all participants is frankly amazing. But right, grounding people or questions in these lived experiences is really what I think is the secret sauce that makes this process a success. And then finally, I mentioned a few of the unique projects insights, but frankly, working through an engagement process in this manner makes better projects, plans, or programs for communities, because you truly understand what folks are living through, but what would also resonate with these communities too. And as a result, you can plan or design things that resonate with your broader community. And to the point that Melissa made earlier, there's almost like a targeted universalism aspect of this, similar like American Disability Act is the example I give in the past, where we put cutouts and ramps and sidewalks in order for folks in wheelchairs to be able to access buildings and public rights of way more easily. But what had happened was it also provided a lot of benefits to other people in the community that maybe didn't have physical ability challenges, like people pushing strollers or people pulling luggage. Like all of those people benefited from that design intervention, but it came from targeting the individuals who would be most heavily impacted by that intervention in order that provided those benefits to the rest of the community. I think this co-design process is exactly the same. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. This is one pretty interesting note too that I'll end with, is that by participating or creating these co-designer positions, the co-designers themselves are finding that basically they have expertise that is wanted and desired by other organizations in the community. So we have a person that was working in the banking world for 12 years, participated as a co-designer. They were a community leader, and part of their decision to accept a equity specialist position at Rochester Public Schools was by being a co-designer. Gave her the confidence and I think interest in kind of exploring this as a career opportunity. So there's these other kind of additional impacts that these processes afford. So sorry, I think I was over time, even though I did my best. So sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for sharing all of the things that are happening in Rochester, and some of the insights into and outcomes that you're seeing are really great to hear about. I've heard you speak on this a few times now, and it's always of interest. And I'm excited to hear the updates and what's going on too. So, are there any quick questions for Kevin at this time? The chat's very quiet today. Hopefully we have some. Hi, Wendy. I see your hand raised.
I just want to say how impressed I am with how you gathered your thoughts and what you were able to accomplish in Rochester. I'm originally from Zumbrota, kind of hung out in the Rochester area, and I know what a valuable thing you're bringing to get people to go over to Soldiers Field. So it's a gorgeous park, and I'm just amazed that you brought community along in that. And what was your tie-in to bring some skeptics into what your plan was? Because you always have those where lived experience seems so very pie in the sky. You know, we can't do that. Our business minds have a hard time going there. So I'm just curious how you encouraged people to go along with your idea, or wasn't that an issue?
That's a really good question. It absolutely was an issue. I think the framing of it as a pilot and say, well, we're going to try this novel approach one time. It also came or was born out of and reformed kind of by a steering committee that we pulled together in town. A group of government, nonprofit institutions, Mayo Clinic, and others were participating in that. And this group over time, it was called the City for Health Steering Committee, because that's the vision of the DMC, is to create a city for health. It's like the biggest problem that we thought that we could address immediately was increasing participation from community members that have been historically disenfranchised, which I thought, just thinking about it now and saying it out loud, was very powerful, right? Like the easiest, lowest entry way that we can create a healthier community is by getting broadening representation and participation in public decision making. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So yeah, as we developed kind of our approach, and the way that we couched it was, we want to do this as a prototype and a pilot and learn from it. And if kind of with the understanding that if it was terrible and it caused pain, we would never do it again. But I think there's a lot of people interested in making it a success. So that certainly helped. And we, as you can see, I've shown 2 examples here, but there's 6 other active planning examples in the community right now that are using co-design. So it's really taken off.
Thank you, Kevin. If there are any other questions that come up, feel free to add those in the chat and we can circle back to. So next up on our agenda, we have Jonee. And Jonee, you're going to share your screen, I think.
Either way, I sent slides. I can share my screen if that's easier.
Which would you prefer?
Maybe have you do the slides, just because I'm not used to Teams and the navigation.
Let me get them set up here. They're coming. Hold on. Well, you can introduce yourself. Maybe you should tell your other hat that's related to GreenStep first.
Yeah, okay. Put the other hat on. I know Kristen also because I lead Minnesota GreenStep Schools, which is a little sibling program to GreenStep Cities, launched in 2020, just before the pandemic, which is great timing. And very excited about the opportunities for cities and schools to collaborate. So I welcome any contact about that as well. And while you're setting up the slides, just wow, and all of the prior presenters. I mean, the BP24 looks fabulous. I think it's gonna be a great resource, and the examples shared in Winona and Rochester and all of this work. It's just really exciting. We have to rewatch this whole webinar.
All right, I'm trying to get them pulled up on full screen, and so let me try one more thing.
Okay. And I'll just start introducing myself while you do that too. So I'm Jonee Brigham. I'm a senior research fellow at the Minnesota Design Center, and presenting today on design for community regeneration, or D4CR, and our work in City of Warren, Northwest Minnesota, who bravely volunteered to be a pilot project with us, and want to acknowledge the funding from Regional Sustainable Development Partnership and from the City of Warren, and in-kind and other support from a number of partners that are listed, acknowledged in the slides. Also want to acknowledge someone I normally co-present with, Tim Griffin, who couldn't be here today, and Dewey Thorback. The three of us have been enjoying trying to create this model with a lot of partners and support. So I'm not seeing the slides yet. Am I not looking at the right view?
No.
Why don't I try sharing? Do I open the share tray? I'm sorry, I'm not used to Teams.
Yeah, I just can't figure out how to make it full screen on here.
Do you see this now that I've?
Yes.
Okay. And
then just present as normal.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can click on, yeah.
All right. So I covered this introduction slide, and we've been doing this for about 2.5, 3 years from, generating the seed idea to where we're at now. And where we are at now is completed phase 1 of a pilot with City of Warren, and about to enter phase 2, also funded by RSDP, where we build on the first half. So I'm going to kind of report from the middle of a process. So D4CR is starts not with a specific project idea in a community, but starts with kind of at the other end of the spectrum of how wide a view we take. So we're really looking at how do we move the needle on regenerative design and help communities achieve resilience. There's so many grand challenges right now and major shifts underway, from climate and equity and needs for economic development in rural Minnesota, so many challenges. And so this is a process that really starts at, excuse my cough drop, I have a cold, starts at kind of the big picture, which is a challenging place to engage people, from the big picture down to something concrete, but and brings an interdisciplinary team to communities in Minnesota. Our angle is not, we have all of this existing infrastructure and assets, and so we're not looking at completely reinventing any place, but really looking at where is there underutilized land, like golf courses that may no longer be as profitable or as used, or underutilized school districts, maybe still active, but the land may be underutilized, or industrial sites, or other land sources that we can kind of leverage parcel by parcel, but with an eye towards large-scale systemic change. So the process diagram here starts at the left. There's really 4 main phases: discover, dream, decide, and do, that group many sub-phases. And so this process up to prototype is what we did in the last year in phase 1. And now we're entering phase 2, where we're going to prototype, develop feasibility studies, actually build some resources, possibly do some mock-ups with prototype partners. But what happened in phase 1 is that we gather point of view teams, or POV teams. And the purpose of that is absolutely equitable community engagement. We feel that instead of having kind of broad, broadcast kind of invitation to provide opinions, if people can find themselves in these POV groups. One is existing residences and businesses. One is organizations, institutions, and new residents. One is government or government like watershed districts, these kind of entities. And one is investors, whether local or external. And that if we can organize people into these groups that can talk about these values common to that role or that point of view, and they actually come up with a good diversity of inputs, where we're not just looking at each individual having an opinion, but it's through that dialogue within those POV groups that some of the values of that POV group come to light. That's the goal. And this has been modeled before this dimension. This is a process that builds off of other geodesign processes, but it's new in this particular configuration. So, so first of all, it's the people of the place and gathering them and understanding their values. GIS place mapping as a geodesign process, it leverages the power of geographic information systems and really takes a lens of systems layers in a place. So water, I mean, in some ways, some of it's sort of parallel to a comp plan, so there's, water and green infrastructure and housing and transportation, but we also have layers or layer groups for economic development and equity. So equity is not only desired in how and I'm going to talk more about how we recruit members, but not only in our process, but also in our understanding of place and trying to understand patterns of equity. So we actually chose the city of Warren because it was a GreenStep city, and and they were kindly accepted our our invitation to join a pilot. But the process uses a modified version of the 21 CD scorecard that you'll see a little bit more of later, but that's that little scorecard symbol. And we really try to understand, okay, based on this scorecard, which maps things like place, water, energy, health and happiness, materials, equity, beauty, and economic development as part of our modification, and a lot of subcategories. The scorecard, one of the reasons we chose it is that on one side is standard practice, and on the other end is the ideal state of a regenerative community. In other words, we may not even know how to do some of these things, but other things, we know there are net zero buildings. Could there be net zero cities? So it's really a bold, that final column, that's, along the lines of our game-inspired engagement, that's the epic win, that's maybe longer range. And whether it's achievable or not, our theory of change is that engaging with that vision is a powerful motivator and breeds innovation. So we start with discovering, where is the city now? And Warren is by no means started from zero. They're a leading, city in green development. And so they're already scoring on the regenerative scorecard. And then we compare that to what we call a backcast scenario. Backcasting is in contrast to forecasting. It looks at where are we at and where are trends and how might we navigate the future. Backcasting says, what is the future we want to have? And starts from that vision and works backwards to prioritize steps to get there. So we bracket this from where are we now and where would we like to go? And then we create a number of menu items that's represented by this grid across all of these different systems, and ideally integrating multiple systems. So there's stacked infrastructure we talk about. I'm just going to back up here. For example, this concept of stacked infrastructure, this sketch here is an agrivoltaic concept. So agrivoltaics take energy systems, this is solar panels raised above a farming area, and food production. And if it's a community garden, social space, you have social infrastructure, food infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And that's what we mean by, how can we find the greatest co-benefits in a given acre or a given parcel that provide synergistic benefits. And in fact, fun fact is that agrivoltaics, the added vegetation under the solar panels can actually improve their performance because it keeps them at a cooler operating level. And the solar panels over certain kinds of crops can actually provide the partial shade that optimizes their growth. So synergistic not only in efficiency of land use, but also sometimes, hopefully, we look for these opportunities that are synergistic in performance. So that was just an example of one of many kinds of menu items that the community helps generate. And then we, with this menu of potential innovations as they could occur in a place, the teams, POV teams that have been informing the process all along, break into groups in a workshop, and they each generate their own prioritized set of menu items that lead toward this vision, but maybe have different ideas. And then there's a process of negotiation. It's really about finding common ground and listening to each other's points of view until we come to a consensus model. So that's the idea. We're right here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the engagement process. So,
Jonee, I'm just checking the clock here and realizing we're a bit behind. So I don't want to rush you, but want to make sure we have time for our other presenters too.
Okay. Yeah, I see. I'm just about done with my 10 minutes. So I'll go pretty quickly. I think you saw the overview there. There is a website, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. Warren is one of 3 cities that are engaging in northwestern Minnesota. It doesn't directly intersect tribal lands, but we acknowledge that there are tribal lands within the region that we're studying that are intersecting, and of course, all of North America's tribal homelands. So this is not, but we wanted to acknowledge, I guess, that as we move more into regional issues, that is a potential to engage. I want to also acknowledge City of Warren, their leadership, Shannon Mortensen, who's their city administrator, and Carrie Miska. This was an important, thinking of your trusted local liaison. Kevin, Carrie Miska, citizen coordinator, she's coordinated other events in Warren, and so she was the coordinator of the 4 POV teams. And of course, we're building off of a lot of momentum in Warren. This is sort of an added layer that's helping them move forward. I would say with the principles, it's always, so looking at equity and inclusion, we look at principles, process, and performance. Principles, you have to upfront say, what do you stand for? This was done both through D4CR and RSDP, and that's one step. The process, the actual engagement process, these are some principles that guided that. And since you're going to get the slides, I'm just going to leave it there. And internet is an issue. We were doing this during the pandemic, which actually offered some opportunities as well as challenges. Not everyone has internet access. We weren't able to assess who might have wanted to be involved in our online community engagement and couldn't be, but we did note that there were some people that could have only been involved through an online process, and that if we had local open houses only, more traditional process, they might not have been able to be at the table. So ultimately, we think multimodal is the way to engage more people. You saw this diagram before. This is just an example from a prior project of the different plans that come out and how they narrow down to one. One of the strategies that came out of the online engagement is a heavy use of Miro, which is an online whiteboard space, and we tried to create a little community room there with a vestibule and a welcome mat, some cookies and coffee, and some sense of play. But ultimately, breakout rooms went to different tables at different stages to brainstorm ideas, trying to simulate that open house feel and also keep a record of input. The menu workshop, participants brainstormed what might be an opportunity in Warren. And then in the visioning workshop, we community members prioritized bundles. And where we're at right now, some of the top rated or top prioritized bundles were School is Resilient Hub, 100% clean energy independence, and a local garden market for food security, as well as economic development. But there was a lot of ideas out there. I can't possibly cover them all. And I just want to say that equity was not only an issue in engagement, but also in how we assessed the results of the design. So here's a little bit more detail from 21 CD, but really it opens up into more detail too. But there's a whole section in 21 CD about equity. In other words, to be a regenerative community, you need to be an equitable community, which only makes sense. But it's not just a principle, it's there are metrics there. And I'm just going to say we had challenges with participation. Probably didn't engage enough modes. We're kind of learning during the pandemic as we're learning during a pilot. But the people that were able to participate were very positive. We're glad that we have a phase 2. We can learn from phase 1 and do more multimodal outreach. And maybe just point out that the systems view is valuable because things like energy burden are part of energy systems and planning and equity systems. There are many issues where equity intersects other systems, and this kind of multi-systems view can raise more issues and find more intersections. Thank you to all our partners, and that's how to contact me. And I am sorry for going over. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I had some issues getting your slides up to begin with anyway. So we will definitely share your slides with everyone to look at it. And yeah, thanks, Jonee. You've been kind enough to let me personally be a fly on the wall throughout this process. And thank you to the City of Warren too for letting me kind of see how this works. It is very systems based, but that doesn't mean that you can't have really deep engagement as a part of this. And I've really valued watching this process and hopefully seeing some really great innovative outcomes come out of it. So
thank you for being part of it, Kristen.
Thanks. All right. Can you stop sharing your screen? And were there any questions for Jonee before we hop on to our next speaker? Okay.
If you're particularly interested in it, we do have a convening on October 1st. Contact me if you would like to come. It's an online day-long deep dive.
Yes. Thank you. I'm not seeing any questions, but feel free to pop them into the chat box if they do come up still. But for now, we can move on to our next speaker. And so Becky, I see you're on here. And I hear you do not have slides, but I can share a video for you. So let me know when you want to share that video and I'll get that going.
Thank you so much. That's the first question I was going to ask. So can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Well, first I want to thank Melissa for including us in the Green Team Guide and for inviting me to speak today. I am retired as of June 18th, and so the project I'm talking about today, the Circle of Healing, was a project that I facilitated and project managed for 10 of the 18 years that I worked at the Blandin Foundation. And I want to give a shout out to Chris for being a BCLP alum. I always like to be in spaces with alums. And there are a lot of them out there in rural Minnesota. I'm coming to you today from Grand Rapids, Minnesota, where it is sunny. I am sitting on 1855 treaty territory land. And that's one of the things that as a white person who grew up here in the Grand Rapids area, I had a lot of learning to do about where I lived and who was on this land before my ancestors were on this land. And so one of the lessons that we learned in building trust and building relationship was to keep an open mind for learning about where you are and the people who are here and were here and are still here today, which is super important. A couple of things that guided this work, and I don't have slides. I'm just going to talk from my heart. You know, when I first started working in Indian country, I used to have my slides and I used to have everything, all my ducks in a row. And then people would get up and they would set out their tobacco and say, I'm going to speak to you from my heart today. And so that's how I'm approaching this. And I am actually going to set my timer. I forgot to do that when I started talking because I just have 10 minutes. It's hard to take 10 years, and I was thinking, well, I could do a minute a year, but then that was too linear. Building relationships and building trust. I'll do the headline right up front. You need to show up. You need to show up with humility. You need to show up in a humble way. You need to keep going. So you need to sustain relationships. I mean, there are a million reasons why people, as a white woman, would not trust me in Indian country. And I'm speaking to you today with the little bit of knowledge I've learned over 10 years working with people, mostly at Leech Lake, which is 17 miles to the west of me. You need to be willing to learn, and you need to be willing to adjust. And that is adjust your worldview, question your worldview, hold that open, adjust your process, and adjust your priorities, because sometimes when you're working in communities, your priorities aren't necessarily theirs, and they don't align. And so you have to be willing to adjust, to flex, to make accommodations. That just because, you know, you have it in your work plan to get these things done in a certain amount of time, that doesn't always work when you're working with communities, and especially communities that are not resourced in the same way that perhaps yours is. So those are some of the bigger things kind of to keep in mind. The other thing is, early on in the circle, we adopted, and I'll tell you about the circle a little bit more here in a second. We adopted the words of an Aboriginal elder named Lila Watson. And she said, if you come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come here because your liberation is bound up in mine, then let's work together. So that was one of the key underpinnings of the group. The Circle of Healing started out of a community desire. It wasn't the Blandin Foundation who went out and said, hey, let's start this work. It was a group of people who came to the Blandin Foundation and says, we really want to start building bridges across neighbors, and we want to do that. And so I was tasked and honored to convene them, to facilitate them, and to project manage them for 10 years. And in the philanthropy world, we call that backboning, collective action, backboning. So a group of Indigenous and white people had a shared experience at White Earth. They went to, and I was with them, went to a day of workshops around mostly healing from intergenerational trauma. And we were the 5 white people who were there, were the 5 white people out of 250. And it's one of those things that you have an experience, and they were like, we need to keep going. We need to learn more. And so I started convening them. Melissa wanted me to talk a little bit about process that I used. And I used the circle way. I don't know who's familiar with the circle process. That's one of the modalities that I was trained in. So I thought, bringing them together in circle and using that process and the structure of the circle would be the best way to bring people together into space to learn and to share. And one of the big learnings was that talking is action. When you're trying to build trust, spending some time up front, just allowing people the space to hear, to be heard, and to listen is so important. The other thing I want to make sure I include is that feeding people is really good. And so all of our meetings included food. So we started meeting in circle. We did not take on any activity, any projects for almost the whole first year. I tried to make action happen like that, but it never did. And in fact, we were at a meeting in Inger, and I had my sticky wall up, if you've ever seen the blue sticky walls, and we were going to do some action planning. And it was getting down to like the last 5 minutes of the meeting. And I really wanted to come out of that meeting with some actions that the group was uniquely positioned to take. And the sticky wall just like slid down the wall. I mean, off the wall. And it was like, well, we're not going to be doing this. And so that was a big lesson for me. So I used the circle format. Also, the group identified their own purpose, and we would look at the purpose every year to make sure that we are still on track with our purpose and adjusting that. And at the beginning of the meeting, we would out loud say our purpose statement, and we actually had guiding principles as well. And those were based on the Ojibwe Seven Grandfathers teachings. And those include things like trust, bravery, love, respect, wisdom. And so we would use those as ways to keep us focused and guided in our shared purpose. Because when you're putting cross-culturally people together who've never sat together and who don't really know each other, it's easy in any group. You guys probably all know this, right? If you've facilitated groups before, it can get kind of more personal, and people will go like, okay, well, this person did this and this person said this, and you have somebody who is sitting next to the head of probation who has been arrested numerous times, and so just having that structure in place was really good. Staying focused on the purpose and the guiding principles really kept folks focused on the work that we were doing together and our real purpose, which was to build awareness and more cross-cultural awareness and being good neighbors, to each other. So when we did decide to start working on projects, oh gosh, see, it's almost over. We started small, we worked big. And so we did some super huge things, and Melissa wanted me to share with you some of the things we did. We raised the Leech Lake tribal flags in the above the courthouse and the Chamber of Commerce in Grand Rapids. We partnered with our local police department to offer 11 sessions of Anishinaabe Worldview training to all of the police officers in town, a lot of the educators in town, and other folks who were in the helping business. We brought Why Treaties Matter. If you haven't seen that, whytreatiesmatter.org up into the greater Itasca area for 2 years, 22 sites, it visited schools and public spaces. And one of the last projects we worked on was building a park in Ball Club, where we have been meeting for the last 5 years. And with that, if we could show, I've got like 2 minutes left, so let's go ahead and run that film. This is taken in Ball Club at the community center, and it's words about what the circle means to circle participants. So let's go ahead and show that now.
Becky, I really want to, but we are behind time. So I did put it in the chat. It's only 2.5 minutes, so I definitely encourage everyone to watch that as you can. But I want to make sure there's time for Wendy to speak too. So
okay. Sorry,
Becky, I hate doing this. I do see one question from Alexis. She says it's in the chat. This is really interesting. She wants to know if it was the same people involved over the 10 years. If not, how did you include new people who attended after it was off and running?
Yes, that's a great question, Alexis. Group membership did change over time. People retired, they moved on to different positions. We always kept it open, and we onboarded people. We have a history, we have, our creation story, and we would onboard people. And then I kept, which I think Melissa has, which we can also share, a pretty hefty fact sheet about the group and all of the projects the group did over 10 years. And we just flexed, for example, for the flag raising, we had a whole bunch of people who came on for that purpose. And then some of them kind of cycled off, and we had new people. So depending upon what we were doing and the activity we were focused on or the project we were focused on, the group flexed. The last project was a park in Ball Club. It was almost a 5-year project, over $200,000. This park was envisioned by the kids who live there, and we had to bring on all kinds of partners to make that happen. Yeah. So using our resources, Kevin talked about working with other groups. So true. Reach out to other groups to do the work.
Thank you, Becky. I'm so sorry to cut out your video. I want to watch it myself. But thank you for joining us and bringing in the work that you've done. And I hear you're retired now, so
yeah,
you know,
but still working on that park.
Yep. Thank you for joining us and sharing. And so we will move on now to our last presentation. So Wendy, I see you on here. And did you want to share your screen?
I do have slides. I wasn't sure if I sent it to Melissa, but if you would rather I just share them, I can give that a shot here.
Oh my. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Things are happening. I think I can pull those up too.
I can do this if you want.
There you go.
Can you see my slides? Yeah. Is it me in control or you?
You.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I'm Wendy Thompson. I am coming to you from Bemidji, Minnesota, and I work as the executive director of Beltrami Area Service Collaborative. The group that we are working with that developed this project has named themselves the Beltrami Area Resiliency Team. We live, as you may be aware of, sort of in the same area as Becky. I have a lot of familiarity with some of the things that she was discussing, and we have a lot of the same strategies that we've been using with our group. We have 3 Native American nations who are right around Beltrami County, with Red Lake Nation being almost all encompassed within the boundaries of Beltrami County. We have about 20% of our population that is Native American, and we also do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of our meetings. I want to just make sure I can forward this here. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the question I was asked to, one of the questions I was asked to address is how the project emerged. So our organization, Beltrami Area Service Collaborative, partnered with Peacemaker Resources and a growing list of other community groups to create what we have created with the 100 Cups of Coffee. More Resilient Minnesota is a statewide movement of 90 different collaboratives across Minnesota. We are focused on children's mental health, family services, and the success of kids in schools. And we've run into so many community planning projects where people are well-intentioned, but we just don't have that lived experience at the table. And so we keep coming up with the same recycled ideas that we think are going to help people. And as Becky said, not thinking about just helping others, but inviting them to the table is just so critical to all in community. We had a community conversation in the summer of 2019, and the big question was, how can we support the well-being of those who live here? And we looked around the room and everybody said, we are not inviting with intention the people whose voices we most need to hear. And so a group of us was sort of charged with how are we going to change this, and started meeting. We meet monthly now using that same circle format that Becky talked about. Our resiliency team mission we designed together. The first piece is trauma is so significant in our community, the ongoing trauma and historical trauma, and leading community conversations about that. But that second bullet is really what I'll focus on, and that is expanding the network of community members who provide input on what is needed for a healthier, more resilient community. So how are we going to do that? We chose the tool 100 Cups of Coffee. It was actually developed by Minnesota epidemiologist Melissa Adolphson, who now works for Wilder. We adapted quite a bit that tool that she had first created on our team, and we tailored questions that would work for what it is that we needed to understand from our unique community. And we also realized if we were going to go out and have one-on-one conversations, which that is what 100 Cups of Coffee is, we needed to develop a training for those who are volunteering to do this. So we needed to explain to them how to build that trust, how to listen intently, how to communicate the purpose of what it was that we were doing. And we also hired an independent evaluator to compile the trends and insights. So as we did interviews, we were keeping notes. We had a whole paper flow of where things needed to go to get to her, and the anonymity of who it was that we were interviewing was held throughout the process. And there's really been a statewide interest from different organizations in our work on this. At the heart of this is, the power of building connection and empathy and knowledge. So we didn't want to just interview people. We wanted to ask them if they wanted to be engaged in some other way and what we would do as a result of what we heard. And we're finding people are attending our meetings and are interested in what our next steps are going to be. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. We developed the 13 questions. A lot of them were what if scenarios. And we are developing a toolkit right now that others can use if they wanted to use this 100 Cups of Coffee method. So this was during the pandemic. We kicked off March of 2020, and you know what else kicked off then? We did some outdoors interviews when that worked for us, but we did a lot over the phone and over Zoom, and people, they were just amazing. They gave us, like I say here, a wealth of knowledge. They were generous. They showed vulnerability and what they were willing to share. And we really appreciate the time. It took about 45 minutes each interview, and we are still in contact with those that indicated they wanted to be in contact with us. That's part of our project. So we have a report that was published February of 2021, but we really didn't stop there. We actually call this our first 100 Cups of Coffee. We anticipate we're going to continue to use this tool in maybe a more specific way as we're looking at community projects and helping organizations who want to have more community engagement that values lived experience. So we are still learning. I come to this with a lot of humility about all of the things that we continue to learn. We're sharing and we're gathering more input. So once we had the report, we went out and did presentations to community groups, and they were community conversations. So we were still having that continued conversation with the community. Maybe you weren't interviewed, but please come to our Zoom event, and then we would break out in rooms and we would have people continuing to answer the same questions that we had. So we had a presentation of the information, but hey, what else is there? So that was really interesting, and also went to the media and went to leadership. So like our county administrators, our city council, other leadership groups to show them what we had learned. And so we continue to do more sharing and more gathering of information and working toward new partnerships. So in the conversations that we had, we overemphasized those who have been traditionally, historically marginalized from the table. So you'll see 35% Native American, 11.43% Black, and then also Asian and Hispanic represented about half of the people that we interviewed. And if you think about who it was that we interviewed, it was a lot of warm handoffs. So trust is so important. So if someone knew someone that they thought had something to contribute, they gave us the name, and then they gave them hey, you're going to get a phone call from this group. Here's what they're doing. Here's why they're doing it. Here are the principles they operate under. And we just had a really warm welcoming from folks who were interviewed. Here's an example of what came out, and this is from our report. This is the question we asked, what's something that you know that you wish other people in your community knew and paid attention to? And you'll see in that really mental health and racism and building a sense of connection came up as items that people were quite concerned about. There were 4 main bullet points you can see on the bottom, which I think all of those 4 can go into any sort of community planning that's happening as all of us reflect on programs and structures and systems. Those 4 things could be a part of pretty much any plan that we do as a community, including my organization. We also had some quotes that our evaluator pulled out, and you will see that some of them are just really heartfelt, authentic, sometimes provocative, sometimes in our community conversations, they led to, we had norms about all of what we were doing because we were in circle together, but just some just really interesting, authentic conversation because of some of the quotes. And we read those out loud to each other and gave voice to them. And then here's another example. What's one thing that could be done right now that would make a difference for your community? So, of course, it was during the pandemic. We all wanted to connect, but people did say that even before the pandemic, they felt like there's 2 Beltrami counties and that we don't connect as a community and that there aren't welcoming spaces for some where they feel safe and appreciated. There is I wanted to just give you our Facebook and our website. If you wanted to look at anything, our report is on both of those. Like I said, we continue. There's so much to learn, so much to understand, and I really related to what Becky was saying as far as, when you've got a work plan and you've got grants and people are saying, hey, did you get anywhere on that action plan that you were going to have? And it's so refreshing to hear Becky say this as a, former funder too, that talking is action because we don't listen to each other often enough, and being open to what people are saying and valuing that lived experience. I love the document you guys created. We're going to pull some things out of your GreenStep benchmarks and community engagement to use in our space too. So thank you for that. And thank you for featuring us and for giving me a chance to share today.
So great. Thank you, Wendy, for sharing. And I'm so impressed that you were able to really pull off this work during a pandemic. And it says a lot, right? Like if you can do it, you showed that it can be done. And we shouldn't be hiding behind this scary pandemic thing to avoid community engagement right now. Let's find ways to work around it. So thank you for sharing. I promise that we really try to put a lot of time into our agenda for questions and answer and dialogue and back and forth. And then we always have great presenters and we run out of time. So we are at the end of our workshop and we don't have time left for questions at this point, but I see a couple comments and coming in on the chat. And so, Wendy, maybe you can address those too. I do want to pull up really quick here a reminder. I always like to share the best practice actions, the GreenStep's best practice actions related to our topic today. And this was a really easy one. They all come from our best practice 24, actions 1 through 7. And so you can see that as a resource again here. And then finally, just to wrap things up for us, we have workshops coming up. So our next one will be October 20th, and we'll be talking a little bit more, related to green teams and city commissions, but how they can advance sustainability and work on sustainable development within communities, within your communities. So others coming up, you can find those on our website. I'll throw in the chat here, but thank you everyone for spending the morning with us, and we will follow up with you all for the workshop recording and the PowerPoint slides, all of that, and great resource links and everything. So we will hopefully see you next time. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you, Melissa and Chris, for your hard work in pulling together this agenda and reaching out to our presenters to share today. Keep up the good work, everyone. I'm looking forward to seeing your new community engagement and equitably